Snow moved across the Wyoming Valley like a living thing, whispering against the earth, folding itself over cabins and fences and the bones of a world that had learned to endure silence. Ruth Ashford walked through that whiteness with her coat pulled tight around the small swell beneath her ribs, her breath trembling in the air like a fragile promise she no longer knew how to keep. 23, soft-voiced, raised by a seamstress who once believed the world could be kind, she pressed forward through the drifts as though the land might swallow her if she ever slowed. Chayton Blackhawk's shadow walked with her even though he was nowhere in sight. The Cherokee horsebreaker had marked her summer with quiet, unexpected gentleness, a man carved by the government's demands and the tribe's fractured past, his voice a low rumble shaped by storms older than her life. Their closeness had crept in slow as moss over stone, born not of stolen glances or brazen desire but of shared tasks, shared silences, shared moments where one soul leaned just slightly toward another without meaning to. It wasn't romance, not at first. It was recognition. Two people carrying different griefs, brushing shoulders at the edge of the same fire. But summer had turned to autumn, and autumn to frost, and frost to the night she told him she carried his child. Even now, as snowflakes clung to her lashes, she remembered the way the air had broken between them. His expression had hardened, not with cruelty, but with a fear so old it seemed borrowed from generations. He had stood there like a man guarding a wound the world had carved into him long before he ever touched her hand. He spoke of bloodlines hunted, families torn apart, names erased from the land like chalk. He said a child born through him would inherit danger, not safety. His voice cracked when he said he could not go through another life buried too soon. So he forced the choice upon her. Him or the pregnancy. His heart or the beating within her belly. The kind of choice only a desperate man or a broken one could give. She remembered her breath catching, remembered the way her fingers curled around the edge of the table to keep from collapsing right then. She remembered choosing. Not out of defiance but out of instinct. Out of love so instinctive it frightened her. She chose the little life forming under her heart, the small, silent hope she had not asked for but could not abandon. He walked away. Not angrily, not loudly, just walked. As if he believed distance could save them all. She never called after him. Pride had nothing to do with it. She simply knew he wouldn't look back. By November, whispers had begun curling around her mother's cabin like vines looking for a place to dig in. Folks in town said Ruth was foolish, reckless, touched by a romance that should never have been allowed to spark. They pitted her mother, Evelyn, whose health was failing so quietly it felt like watching a lamp dim wick by wick. Evelyn had once sewn dresses for ranch wives and officers' daughters, humming while she worked, but illness had worn her down to a soft, trembling kindness that Ruth tried desperately to protect. The pregnancy grew heavier as the snow deepened. Ruth hauled wood, cooked meals she barely tasted, tended to her mother's nightly fever, and tried not to look at the path leading toward the fort where Chayton once broke horses at dawn. She told herself she did not miss him. She only missed the version of herself she had allowed to believe in gentleness. Winter pressed harder with each passing week. Then came the night the storm cracked open the sky. Her mother lay asleep beside the fire, coughing in shallow fits, while the wind screamed through the gaps in the walls like some old ghost demanding tribute. Ruth felt the first stab of pain ripple through her belly, sharp and sudden. She thought it too early, thought maybe it was simply the cold biting deep, but another pain followed, stronger, rolling through her like a tide she could not resist. She labored alone. Snow slammed against the roof. Light flickered in frantic rhythm. Her knees dug into the floorboards as she gripped the edge of the bed frame, her breath breaking apart in gasps. She whispered for strength. Whispered for her mother not to wake in panic. Whispered for the small child who had not yet drawn breath but already carried every hope she dared not voice aloud. Hours passed. Pain surged. Her fingers shook as she reached for anything that might help her push through the storm inside her body. When at last the baby came, the storm went silent, as though the world itself had paused to listen. But no cry broke the air. No breath, no softened whimper, no tiny fists curling against her skin. Just stillness. Cold and vast and merciless. She wrapped the little boy in her shawl, pressing her forehead to his, begging whatever powers still roamed these mountains to let him stay, just for a moment, just for a single fragile chance. But death had taken him before she ever had the chance to speak his name. When dawn came, she moved through the motions with numb resolve. Her mother slept fitfully, unaware of the small, still bundle held to Ruth's chest. Ruth stepped into the blinding white of morning, shovel in hand, each footstep cracking frozen earth beneath her. She found a place under the cedar tree, the only green left in a world swallowed by winter. She dug until her hands bled, until her breath tore her throat raw, until the ground gave way. She laid her son there, pressed the shawl gently around him, ran her fingers through the cold air above him as if smoothing his hair one final time. She whispered that she was sorry, that she had chosen him, that she wished choosing him had been enough. When she stood, she felt something shift inside her. Not strength, not exactly, but a quiet resolve that wrapped itself around her like a second spine. Winter had taken much, but she would not let it take the last of her spirit. Snow fell again, soft and relentless, as she turned back toward the cabin. She didn't see the figure far off near the tree-line, watching her with the posture of a man suffering his own private undoing. She didn't need to see him to feel the weight of the past stirring back to life. Chayton had returned, and whatever reckoning winter had spared her so far was only beginning to rise through the snow. Snow lingered long after it should have loosened its grip, spreading across the valley in pale, unbroken sheets that made every step feel like wading through memory. Ruth Ashford moved carefully through the cold mornings, tending to her mother and the small cabin that now felt too quiet, too hollow, too aware of the absence carved into its walls. Grief had a way of making sound itself retreat. Even the wind seemed to hush when it passed her window, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile balance she was struggling to keep. It was on one such morning, thin light stretching across the frostbitten fields, that her legs betrayed her. She had gone to fetch water from the creek, her arms weak from too many nights without sleep, her breath shallow from the weight she carried inside. Halfway back the world blurred. The bucket slipped from her grasp. Snow spun up like startled birds. Then everything went dim, edges softening until she felt nothing at all. Silas Boonhart found her that way. A man who preferred silence to chatter, observation to interference. He had been riding the fence line of his property, checking the strands where winter liked to test its claws. His horse snorted at the sight of her collapsed in the drift, drawing Silas's gaze. He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots sinking deep into the snow as he knelt beside her. Ruth looked small in the vast white landscape, her face pale and her lashes dusted with frost. Silas touched her shoulder with a gentleness that felt out of place on a man of his size. When she didn't stir, he scooped her into his arms, cradling her as though she were made of something fragile and irreplaceable. Her head rested against his chest, and he noticed the faint tremor of her breathing, the hint of exhaustion etched into her expression even in unconsciousness. He carried her to his cabin, one of the sturdiest structures in the valley, built by his father and strengthened by his own hands. Inside, warmth breathed from the stone hearth. Silas laid her on the cot near the fire and pulled a blanket over her, then set water to heat. He didn't speak. Words felt too heavy for the moment. Instead, he watched her with a quiet concern, studying the way grief had hollowed her cheeks, how tightly she held her hands even in sleep, as if bracing for something to strike. When she woke, the firelight flickered across her face, and confusion clouded her eyes for a moment before recognition softened her expression. Silas sat at the small wooden table repairing a broken bridle strap, but he set the leather aside as soon as she stirred. She tried to rise, murmuring an apology, as if collapsing in the snow were an inconvenience she had forced on the world. Silas placed a steady hand near her elbow, not touching, just offering support if she wished it. His voice was low, warm, and even. He told her she could rest a moment before braving the cold again. She hesitated, looking down at her hands, then nodded slightly. Her limbs felt too weary to argue. Silas poured her a tin cup of warm water and set it in her hands. Ruth didn't ask how long she'd been there or whether anyone had seen her. Instead, she thanked him quietly, her voice soft as wine through pine needles. She explained she couldn't stay long, her mother needed tending. Silas listened without interrupting, his gaze steady but never prying. When she rose to leave, he offered to walk her back, though he made the offer as though it were simply practical, not pitying. Ruth declined, out of pride or out of fear of what kindness might unravel in her, but Silas handed her his spare scarf anyway, telling her she might return it someday or not at all. She hesitated again before taking it, fingers brushing the wool with something like gratitude and something like sorrow. Days passed and the storm grew meaner. Snow piled against roofs and fences, pressing a hush over the world that carried both comfort and threat. Ruth's chores became harder. Her mother's cough deepened. And though Ruth didn't seek help, help found her. Silas began appearing at the edge of her property with small offerings, extra firewood, a sack of potatoes, a handful of nails to fix a sagging porch board. He never asked for thanks, never lingered long. He simply set the items where she could find them and returned to his horse. But Ruth noticed. She noticed the footprints in the snow, the slightly reshaped fences, the chopped wood stacked higher than she remembered. She understood these gestures were not charity. They were wordless acknowledgments of her burden, quiet extensions of strength given freely. Eventually she found the courage to speak more than a passing thanks. One morning, as he finished repairing the cabin latch that winter winds often battered open, she stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee. Her voice shook slightly, not from cold but from the effort of letting another soul close enough to witness her vulnerability. Silas accepted the cup with a small bow of his head. They drank in silence, staring out over the valley as the sky pinked with dawn. Ruth felt a strange sense of safety in his presence, as though simply standing near him eased the ache behind her ribs. Slowly their exchanges grew into something gentler. Ruth found herself speaking of her mother's illness, of the quiet dread she carried each night, of the grief still pressing against her heart like a bruise that refused to fade. Silas listened, steady as a winter pine, offering few words but offering them with sincerity. He told her that loss doesn't leave easily, that some wounds simply learn to breathe with us. His honesty didn't sting, it steadied. Rumors began circling through town soon enough. Folks always noticed when a woman received help from a man, especially a man like Silas, quiet, strong, unattached, and known for keeping to himself. They whispered that Ruth was healing too fast, leaning too easily. They said a motherless child left her free to chase new comforts. Ruth absorbed the whispers like cold air in her lungs, heavy and unwanted. But Silas ignored them. And eventually, Ruth found herself caring less about the talk and more about the truth she felt beside him. One evening, clouds rolled heavy across the sky, promising another storm. Ruth stood at her child's grave beneath the cedar tree, brushing snow from the small mound. Silas approached quietly, stopping several paces back so she could have her space. She didn't turn, but she felt the warmth of his presence through the cold, a reminder that she was not facing the world alone anymore. When she finally looked back, his expression held no pity, only understanding. That small difference mattered more than she could ever voice. She realized then that Silas was not trying to replace anything she had lost. He was simply showing her that pieces of life could still gather themselves into warmth, even in the dead of winter. In the fading light, Ruth whispered her son's name, something she had not dared speak aloud in weeks. Silas bowed his head, honoring the moment without needing explanation. And for the first time since the storm that took her child, Ruth felt the faint, fragile hint of something returning. A breath of hope, small but real, curling quietly like smoke from a rekindled flame. Winter did not loosen its grip so much as shift it, trading its deep silences for a sharper wind that cut through the valley like an old truth resurfacing. March arrived with a deceptive brightness, sunlight glinting off the snowfields in a way that made the world appear softer than it was. Ruth Ashford knew better. She felt an unease in the air, a change in the way the horizon held its breath. It was the kind of tension that precedes a reckoning. She had been mending one of her mother's worn quilts when the first sign came. A pair of hoofprints pressed into the frost outside her cabin, fresh enough that steam still drifted faintly above them. Silas Boonhart had not visited that morning, and no neighbor rode through this stretch without reason. She stepped to the doorway, her breath catching as a lone figure emerged from the treeline, horse in tow, coat lined with snow and regret. Chayton Blackhawk had returned. He paused several yards away as if unsure whether he still had the right to approach her. The wind ruffled the dark braids hanging over his shoulders. He looked older than when she had last seen him, as though winter had carved lines across his face the way rivers carve gullies into stone. When he finally spoke, his voice came low, steady but strained around the edges. He asked if she would hear him. Ruth did not answer at first. The quilt slipped from her hands, falling across the doorway like a broken sigh. Behind her, her mother slept, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond their threshold. Ruth stepped outside, closing the door softly so no cold touched Evelyn's fragile lungs, then faced the man who had once occupied her summer with quiet tenderness and her winter with quiet destruction. Chayton's gaze dropped to her hands, as though searching for the roundness that was no longer there. For the life he had told her to choose against him. For the child he had never met, never held, never heard cry. When realization settled across his features, his breath stilled. He whispered the question he already knew the answer to. Ruth lowered her eyes and something inside him fractured. He asked when it happened, why no one told him, why she hadn't sent word. But Ruth lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. She told him that when a man walks away from life inside a woman, he forfeits the right to be called back when that life falters. Chayton staggered as if struck, stepping backward until the snow crunched beneath his boots like brittle bone. Silas appeared over the hill at that moment, leading his horse with one hand and a bundle of firewood with the other. He slowed when he saw the two of them, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in caution. He could sense the past reopening itself like an old wound. He set the wood down quietly, approached with deliberate calm and greeted Chayton with polite formality, though his posture remained protective, angled subtly toward Ruth. Chayton bristled at the sight of him. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He demanded to know why Silas had taken responsibility for Ruth when it was not his place, why he had stepped into a story that did not belong to him. Silas did not rise to the provocation. He simply looked at Ruth, offering her the chance to decide what part of her story she wished to speak aloud. Ruth inhaled slowly, her breath shivering in the cold. She explained that Silas had taken nothing that wasn't freely given. He had not tried to fill her silence, nor mend her with promises. He had simply stood with her when the world felt empty. Chayton's expression twisted, torn between jealousy and remorse. He argued that he had come back to make things right, to shoulder the responsibilities he had once feared. But even in his repentance, Ruth sensed the same desperation that had pushed him to force an impossible choice months before. Behind them, townspeople had begun to gather near the road, drawn by the sight of three figures standing in the snow with the tension of a storm brewing between them. Murmurs spread like smoke. Some believed Chayton had the right to reclaim the woman tied to his past. Others warned that Ruth had been comforted too quickly. The whispering felt like a familiar poison threading its way into her lungs. Ruth turned from the crowd, refusing to let their voices dictate her grief or her choices. She told Chayton she mourned the version of him she once loved, the man who carved small wooden charms for children, who spoke softly to colts trembling after their first saddle, who looked at the stars as though they belonged to someone he missed. But she could not trust the man who abandoned her when she needed him most, nor could she build a life with someone who only sought her now because guilt had finally caught his scent. Chayton stepped forward, insisting he had changed. He spoke of nights spent haunted by what he had done, by visions of her alone through the storm, by dreams of the child he never met. He confessed he had ridden back not only out of regret, but because he feared he would spend the rest of his life wandering without the chance to mend what he had broken. His voice cracked as he said the winter had shown him the truth of his cowardice. Ruth felt the weight of his confession. She felt the sorrow threading through his words like smoke around dying embers. But she also felt the steadiness of Silas beside her, steady not because he sought to claim her, but because he honored her choices without condition. She understood then that love was not built on apologies spoken after loss. It was built on presence, on quiet constancy, on hands that lifted without asking why you had fallen. She told Chayton she forgave him, but forgiveness did not mean return. Forgiveness was a kindness she gave herself, not a door she could reopen for a man who had closed it in fear. Chayton's shoulders slumped, breath shuddering into the cold as the truth settled fully into him. Then the sky darkened, clouds gathering with alarming speed as wind whipped across the valley. A storm was coming, a dangerous one, swift and heavy, carrying the scent of unfinished business. Chayton looked toward the horizon as if reading the omen written there. Silas advised they all seek shelter. Ruth felt the air change again the way the world often did just before a moment that decides the future. The storm would break soon. And with it something else would break open too. The past had returned, but what it demanded was not yet revealed. The truth that would change everything waited in the heart of the oncoming winds, pushing them toward a reckoning none of them could outrun. The storm rolled across the valley with a speed that defied nature, as though the sky itself had been waiting for the moment all three lives converged in the snow. Ruth Ashford stood between Silas Boonhart and Chayton Blackhawk, her breath threading into the rising wind, her heart steady only because she had learned to steady it herself. Clouds churned overhead, heavy and sullen, dark as old wounds that refused to heal. The horses grew restless, stamping the frozen ground, sensing danger before men allowed themselves to. Silas urged Ruth toward her cabin, reminding her that her mother needed protection before the storm sealed them inside. Chayton, still wrestling with desperation and regret, tried to speak again, but the first blast of winter swallowed his words. The wind cut between them like a blade. Ruth gathered her shawl and made for the cedar tree, instinct pulling her toward her child's resting place before shelter. She wanted one moment, one breath of farewell before the world disappeared in white. Chayton saw her turn that way and followed, guilt riding him like a fever. Silas hesitated only a heartbeat before switching direction and following them both, knowing the storm was too dangerous for anyone to wander alone. Snow whipped across the valley, fierce and stinging. The sky sank lower. The storm did not arrive, it descended. Ruth reached the cedar tree as the wind howled through its branches, bending them until they groaned like mourning voices. She knelt beside the small mound buried beneath a thin crust of ice, brushing the snow with trembling fingers. Memories rose in her, not of pain this time, but of the strength she gained from enduring it. She whispered a promise that she would not be lost again, not even to her grief. Behind her, Chayton approached with uneven steps, the storm pushing him sideways. He tried to speak over the roar but managed only fragments. Apologies, please, remnants of the man he wished he had been. Silas arrived moments later, snow heavy on his coat, eyes sharp with concern. He called to Ruth, urging her toward safety. She rose slowly, guided more by his calm presence than his words. But before she could take a step, Chayton's horse, spooked by the violent gusts, reared violently. Its hooves struck ice, slipped, and the animal lurched sideways. Chayton tried to grab the reins, but the horse toppled into him, knocking him to the ground with crushing force before bolting into the white fury. Ruth gasped as Chayton cried out, one leg pinned beneath the horse's weight before it scrambled away. Silas rushed to him without hesitation, kneeling beside the fallen warrior even as wind clawed at his face. Chayton tried to rise but collapsed again, pain seizing him. Snow piled on his coat, threatening to bury him if they lingered. Ruth moved to his other side, slipping her arm beneath his shoulders. Despite everything between them, despite the wounds neither could ever fully mend, she could not leave him to freeze beneath the sky. Compassion rose in her like instinct. Silas lifted Chayton with a strength earned from years of ranch work. The Cherokee warrior gritted his teeth, shame burning hotter than the pain. Ruth steadied his other side, her breath ragged but unwavering. The three of them, past, present, and the fragile hope of a different future, fought their way through snow that climbed their knees and sometimes their waists, each step a battle against the storm's relentless force. When Silas's horse finally emerged through the white haze, it felt like salvation. He hoisted Chayton onto the saddle while Ruth held the reins steady. The horse trembled beneath the warrior's weight, sensing the urgency. Ruth walked beside Silas as they guided the horse toward the cabin, the storm swallowing everything behind them. Snow stung her cheeks. Her skirts clung heavy to her legs. But she did not falter. Silas's quiet strength anchored her, as reliable as the earth beneath the snow. The cabin's lantern glowed faintly through the storm. Ruth reached the door first, flinging it open as Silas carried Chayton inside. The warmth hit them like a blessing. Ruth quickly stoked the fire while Silas laid Chayton on the cot. Evelyn stirred weakly, startled by the commotion, but Ruth shushed her gently, assuring her all was well enough. Chayton drifted in and out of consciousness, fever kindling in his eyes. In those drifting moments, he spoke truths he had held buried. He spoke of the night he left Ruth, not out of indifference but out of terror. He confessed to seeing his father hunted down, his mother forced to choose which child to save during a raid, memories that left him believing any life tied to him was doomed. His voice cracked as he said he feared becoming another link in a chain of sorrow. He whispered that he loved the child he never met, loved Ruth in a way twisted by fear. Ruth listened in silence, her heart aching not from longing, but from the recognition of a man wrestling his own ghosts. She placed a damp cloth on his forehead, her touch tender but no longer tethered to hope of rekindled love. She whispered that she forgave him, truly forgave him, but forgiveness was not a bridge back to the life they once tried to share. Chayton closed his eyes, a tear carving a line through the grime on his cheek. That truth settled into him not as a wound, but as the first real mercy he had allowed himself to receive. Silas watched from the doorway, not intruding, simply bearing witness with the same steady quiet that had become the foundation of Ruth's healing. When she finally rose and stepped toward him, her grief did not vanish, but she no longer carried it alone. Silas reached out, not to claim her hand, but to let her decide if she wished to place it in his. She did. Outside, the storm raged, shaking the walls, howling across the cedar tree where a small life rested beneath the earth. Inside, Ruth felt something shift, a soft, tentative warmth unfurling like a flame nurtured after too long in darkness. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pure white. Chayton, his leg bound and his conscience lighter, prepared to leave once he could ride again, offering Ruth a final nod, one of gratitude, not possession. He knew his road lay elsewhere, carved by lessons he should have learned sooner. Ruth walked with Silas to the cedar tree. Snow sparkled around them like scattered diamonds. She reached out, and he reached with her, their hands brushing lightly over the mound that had shaped her grief and her strength. She whispered a promise to her child, that she would live, not merely survive. Silas bowed his head beside her, offering no words, only the quiet devotion of a man who understood that healing is slow and love even slower, but worth the patience. And Ruth, standing in the hush of a world remade by storm, finally felt the stirrings of a home she chose with her own steady heart.